Good morning, everyone. This is Paul Eschbach. I'm the Vice President of Operations at IntegraONE. Joining me this morning on the phone is Colby Hausler from Check Point. Colby is a Senior Systems Engineer who IntegraONE has worked very closely with over the past year in our new partnership, and he will be providing our presentation today. Please feel free to jump in with any questions. Both Colby and I are here to answer them, both throughout the presentation and any questions at the end. And please stay interactive. Colby?
Morning. Thanks, Paul. I appreciate the introduction. And just as a short friendly reminder from our folks at IntegraONE, if you have or have not had your coffee, I don't know if that gift card will arrive by tomorrow morning, but definitely we appreciate your attendance. And for those folks who might be joining us late, it will be available here via the IntegraONE site at a later point in time. But in the meantime, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So let's just take a quick look back of kind of what transpired last year from a security, posture perspective. And, as far as, what happened, right? We've obviously definitely seen that kind of transition in the connectivity from, kind of migrating from that endpoint desktop space to that mobile space, right? Everything's connected. And kind of, we've heard talk of the IoT and things that are currently in play, but really it's, what are we doing to secure that entire infrastructure? And to that point, let's take a look at some of the attacks, right? These were definitely kind of groundbreaking attacks that not only affected folks from a domestic here, but also obviously worldwide. And really, it's kind of a tipping point in a sense, right? We have all these security products that are out there, but really, what are we doing to secure our internal infrastructure, and what are you doing for your clients and so forth, whoever that may be? So it's really sobering, and hopefully, you kind of stop and kind of took note of what's transpired over the past 12 to 18 months and what we need to do moving forward. So again, in 2016 was that kind of culmination where the actual mobile space overtook the desktop space. And what does that mean, right? So we have to protect those mobile devices and the data that's on them. And it was a huge attack there from a Gooligan perspective. So it's really sobering, kind of puts things in perspective for us. And again, the NSA tools that were leaked, right? We like to think we're fairly secure here domestically, but those tools that were being used by some of the agencies made their way into some nefarious hands. And how can we prevent that moving forward and kind of keep the tools in the hands of the folks that it should be, right? So to the point, again, we really need to stop and take note of what's going on, kind of currently and kind of where we've been and where we're going. And that's kind of the premise of this slide, right? So if we kind of take a step back and see kind of where we've been and where we're going, way back in the 90s, the 90s were great, the music was great, but really we're referring to that as kind of a Gen 1 type delivery method. It was just viruses, right? So there was essentially a virus. There was a signature written to protect against that, and then we kind of moved on, right? And then we had the different network attacks back in the late 90s and early 2000s, where there might have been an infection that was locally on the network, and it kind of spread its way around as networks were becoming the kind of go-to means to deliver data internally and externally. And then we talk about the Gen 3, the applications, right? So there was malicious applications, whether you were clicking on a URL to download that application, whether it was a browser-based attack, but essentially there was attacks that were transpiring through applications that were being installed, through command and control on the back end in attempts to secure that system and use those compute resources and infect other systems. So we're talking Gen 4 there, right? We're talking about the different payloads, right? Again, they have a varied degree of how those payloads were delivered. Again, via URL, via download link, via embedded in a repackaged application, and really just that kind of next step, right? And then we talked about some of the Gen 5 mega attacks moments ago. Again, that were not only affecting us here domestically, but also on an international standpoint, affecting everybody from hospitals to banks, really the entire gambit. So when we talk about this and kind of break it down in a little kind of more granular standpoint, right? I mentioned the antivirus there before in the 90s and attacks from the internet, and that's kind of where, Check Point came about way back in 1993. Our founder and CEO was actually the inventor of the modern firewall with stateful packet inspection. So we've been doing it for a long time, but you can see that's kind of where those internet-based attacks kind of transpired from. And again, from an app perspective and what was going on there. And that's kind of where IPS came into play, right? And oftentimes these are kind of bolt-on solutions from an IPS perspective. Hey, we've got our firewall over here. We've got another box doing the IPS protection. And again, the morphing content that came about through those Gen 5 deliveries. And sandboxing and anti-bot. So most large major security vendors have some sort of sandboxing solution in play, along with the anti-bot protection. But the real sobering part is a lot of folks aren't leveraging these extra layers of security, right? It's one thing to know there's threats out there. It's another thing to have a recipe how to defend against them. But if you're not implementing that recipe, then really the onus comes back on that partner or the end user. So this really just kind of speaks to the level of folks that are currently leveraging these security technologies, right? So going back to the 2000s and just IPS protection, only 50% of folks are actually using basic firewall and IPS protections, right? So really kind of, you have to stop and ask yourself, we know the threats are out there, we have the technology to prevent or minimize the attacks, but really we're not leveraging the components and the technologies that are required to protect us, right? So let's just take kind of a look back in 2016, and then we'll get to a 2017 look here. And again, this just kind of plays off that point of, we know the attacks are out there, we have the tools to do it, but really just from the stance of who's leveraging those tools, right? And again, it's just that same mindset of, we know they're there, but we really haven't implemented the protections, whether it's a budgetary issue, whether it's, hey, we're fine, we've got cyber insurance, or you just really haven't been impacted. So it's really sobering to have this conversation along, the actual technologies are being used to protect these different platforms that you see here in front of you. So let's jump ahead to 97, just to kind of give us a look back here and see the differentiation and the folks that are actually taking security seriously in these kind of three pillars of security, shall we say, right? So look back to last year, it's minimal, it's a few percentage points, right? Same way with mobile security. Oftentimes I'll be presenting, there could be 200-300 people in the room, and I'll ask, hey, does anybody have any mobile device protection? And, besides the Check Point folks that are in the room or the IntegraONE folks that might be in the room, very few people raise their hand, which is, very concerning, right? We know the attacks are out there, as I mentioned before, that kind of overlay of the mobile devices overtaking the desktop, way back in 2016. So again, we know they're out there. We really have to put those pieces in play. And cloud security, right? It's becoming even a larger footprint for most companies. Obviously, most folks are still leveraging it in kind of a hybrid type mentality. But most folks say, hey, they kind of throw it to the wind. We have our stuff sitting up in the AWS or Azure. So, hey, we're protected, right? And, depending, I know we have a kind of a mix of folks that are on the line from the IT security space to VP of Ops and so forth. But really what that means, essentially, is you really have to take a closer look at it and what stack are you preventing those attacks from. And kind of a layered OSI model, and kind of have layer 1 through 7. And kind of those first 3 layers, the providers are taking care of. But when you kind of get through layer 4 to 7, protecting your apps and kind of access to those virtual machines and so forth, the built-in security controls from said cloud providers are not put in place to do that, right? So if again, we kind of take a historical look back of kind of where we've been and where we're going, and this will kind of help us kind of tell the Check Point story and what could it possibly do for you from a security perspective, and really from the ability to see across your entire infrastructure of what's transpiring. So if we go back even probably 4, 5, 6 years, And if you were reading any of the Gartner articles, a few years back it said, hey, best of breed products were the way to go, right? So what does that mean in today's terms? Essentially have numerous bolt-on offerings to protect the environment, right? But what is that lacking, right? When you have all those disparate technologies in play, you're not seeing that kind of 360-degree visibility of what's going on in the network. So it's really sobering from the standpoint of, yeah, I have all these great technologies, but how many man hours is it taking you to manage that infrastructure? And what type of visibility do you have, right? Any questions so far? Again, just as a reminder, if there are any questions, please drop those in the chat box, and we'll definitely address those as we go through, or at the end if there is anything. So the then and now. So we have our kind of bolt-on ad hoc infrastructure on the left, and there we have kind of the unified architecture. And again, you can see some of those technologies that are going back to the 2000s, where we're talking IPS and next-gen firewall. But again, it's that visibility across an entire infrastructure managed from a single architecture. So for those folks that are the CTOs in the room or the CFOs, this is a very sobering fact, right? This is an internal study that we've done, as well as in conjunction with an external study of how we're getting to these days and numbers, right? So when you have disparate technologies and you're lacking that visibility, 40 days to identify the attack. And obviously recently in the news, the whole Marriott attack, it's possibly going back a number of years on the SPG side that folks had access to that database, right? So this is kind of an average piece, 40 days to identify the attack and over $500,000 of the cost remediation, right? So how does that look in an architecture that's multi-vendor with management that's covering all those facets that you see there? Average 2 days to identify the attack and the cost remediation. So when I look at these two slides side by side, for me, that's an easy way to quantify of spending those dollars. You might not be making a new widget, you might not be increasing, sales, but you can see here that the large disparity of the actual dollars and cents that those attacks cost and the time to remediation along with the cost. So that's a genuine conversation that can be had that most folks can understand, right? We're kind of taking the technical out of the equation and kind of boiling it down and making a numerical conversation in that respect. So what do we need, right? So when we talk about real-time technologies, what are we doing from, as we mentioned earlier, that sandboxing perspective, or what are we doing against those next-gen attacks? And the kind of crazy thing is with a next-gen attack, you can take an existing attack, change a 1 or a 0, and voila, it's now a brand new attack, right? So what type of prevention are we putting in place to minimize the impacts of those attacks? So, you see all these technologies here in front of us, but again, we're using those bolt-on technologies, you don't have that 360-degree visibility. But what if you have all these components that you see in the screen sharing the same kind of what we refer to as threat intelligence? So let's say if a endpoint device, your laptop, someone clicked on a link and that link was blocked on the endpoint, then someone tried to send you that same malicious attack via text message on your mobile. So if we've already seen that attack on the endpoint side, then we have the ability to push that same intelligence and protection to the mobile side. Same thing applies when we're talking, whether you're in data center locally or you're using cloud offerings. If we've seen that attack in the cloud, we're passing that intelligence via our threat cloud to the data center protections, right? So it's really kind of a change in mindset, and definitely from a visibility standpoint. So these are just kind of some of the technologies that we use in our different products that you saw there, whether it's mobile, whether it's endpoint. So really the whole premise here is it's not just those kind of singular technologies that we're looking at, it's all the kind of components of those technologies that behind the scenes, right? You see there in the very middle of the screen that mobile man-in-the-middle attack. While our Sandblast mobile offering protects against malicious Wi-Fi networks and attacks like man-in-the-middle, it protects against malicious applications being installed on that device, and it protects against texting attacks, that mobile device is receiving. And just to kind of point out some other things, there in the bottom left, you have that CPU level sandbox. So Check Point has patented technology that we've developed in-house that essentially we have the ability to go to the CPU level and see what's transpiring there. To kind of give you a quick example of that, so if you launch Microsoft Word on your laptop, we're familiar with how that application is supposed to operate. If there's an instruction or somebody's trying to inject something into that running of that Microsoft Word and trying to send it somewhere else or open a malicious file, we have the ability to detect that because we're analyzing things at the CPU level. So definitely at the root cause as opposed to kind of a superficial response. And when we talk about consolidated management in kind of Check Point vernacular, we refer to our latest management console as R80.20. And essentially, again, really the premise of that technology is allowing you to create policies in one location and pushing those policies across that network infrastructure. So if you have a policy that you've developed in the cloud and you want to replicate that policy locally within your data center, you're essentially creating that policy one time and being able to push that to different facets of the network, right? So in the consolidated management, in conjunction with the threat cloud and all that intelligence I was referencing, it's that holistic kind of 360-degree view of what's transpiring on your network. As well as, again, from a bean counter conversation, it's dollars and cents, right? If I've got to pay a number of folks six-figure salaries to manage that infrastructure, and they're logging in the 5 or 6 management consoles by noontime, but if you can do all that from a single management console, then obviously you're ahead of the game, not only from a manpower standpoint, but from dollars and cents, and of course, allowing your guys to do more meaningful projects that are required in the environment. So what are we doing? You know, when we talk about real-time threat prevention, let me just give you a quick example of this. So essentially, you know, we have Sally in HR. She's looking at resumes all day long, right? Usually via email and oftentimes a Word or a PDF document. So what if we can remove Sally from that security equation? And what do I mean by that? Again, in that email example I was mentioning a moment ago, what if we can remove the text from that attachment and deliver it in a known clean document to Sally without any business impact, right? We're not waiting minutes for an attachment, but we're literally, before that email hits her inbox, removing the text from that document, delivering a known clean document, and within 3 to 5 minutes, if she needs that original document, you can click on a single link and download that document. Again, that's what we refer to in Check Point vernacular. It falls under our sandblast technology, but it's the emulation and the file extraction, right? So as we can all attest, really security is kind of removing that end user from that security equation, right? And that's one of the kind of the key things that we're doing. And when we talk about shared threat intelligence, you know, most major security vendors are part of the community that kind of shares threat intelligence between companies. But what do? We have, I believe it's close to 100 folks that are, you know, constantly just looking at this threat intelligence that's coming across their desk and really what that means to you guys as a partner and end customer. Essentially, you then have the ability of those folks with that expertise, you know, kind of in your back pocket, so to speak, because they're analyzing everything that's coming through the wire, right? And we take great pride in our threat intelligence team. They're definitely best of breed. And again, I've already mentioned the consolidated management. That's really, if going back, I believe it was 5 years ago from Gartner, that Check Point really became the gold standard from a management standpoint. And when I'm at events and I have folks, you know, I know on the Cisco side, on the Palo Alto side, you know, we're chatting security over a drink. You know, it still comes up, hey, your security is pretty good. Well, yours is pretty good. Well, how efficiently can you manage it, right? So let's just kind of take a walk through a kind of typical attack. And this is kind of along the context of the example that I gave a moment ago. So this is kind of what we're doing from a technology standpoint, right? That PDF comes over, we're sandboxing that file, we're looking at any malicious content that's attempting to do any command and control, kind of calling back to the mothership. And we're going to look at that from an analysis standpoint via the threat cloud, right? So you saw where that email came in via on the corporate side, and we're saying, hey, we know that site is bad because we've kind of done our due diligence there, and we're able to block that at the mobile device level. And again, the key takeaway here is that unified management platform, and that kind of 360-degree visibility, right? So you can see, via the threat cloud, that intelligence is being passed across the entire infrastructure. That's the key takeaway here. You just can't do it with bolt-on or ad hoc systems that were the norm a few years back. So really, to summarize, we've kind of walked through, kind of set the table of what's transpired on the back end from a historical standpoint. But really, again, the key takeaway here is we know these attacks are out there. They've been coming for years, but what are we doing to protect ourselves, right? And the key piece here, again, we are at that kind of balancing point, or that inflection point that you see here. We really need to implement the technologies that we have to combat the threats that were out there. And just kind of add some color to this as we move forward into 2019. You might be hearing Gen 6 from Check Point. And what are we talking about when we say Gen 6 protection? A lot of that Gen 6 protection revolves around kind of that IoT space, right? We have sensors that are pushed out, whether it's from a city perspective, that are sitting on lampposts or whatever the case may be, or farmers in fields, and those IoT offerings. How are we securing those vast kind of endpoints, right? We no longer have that kind of corporate hedge of protection, but we need security being passed out, and that analysis being happen on the end. So please, if there's any questions, drop those in the chat. I think we might have something here, but again, what are you guys doing to protect your environments, and how are you doing it? What tools are you using? Is Check Point part of that conversation? And if it's not currently, definitely the folks in Integra can definitely assist with that process, and definitely provide some more color to it. When we talk about, again, Gen 5 security is that holistic approach, being able to protect your environment, whether it's mobile, whether it's endpoint, whether it's in the cloud, whether it's sitting in locally in your data center, right? We really have to start leveraging the tools that we have, at our disposal. So Paul, before I let you kind of give us the backstory here on IntegraONE, are there any questions for me that kind of struck a chord with you possibly, as we're kind of stepping through from a historical perspective, and then obviously from a Check Point perspective? All right, let me check the chat box. All right. Okay, there's a question that came through. It says, can you provide some context around how or why mobile is the next big threat vector, right? Well, I think if we kind of touched on it a little bit ago. Appreciate that question. Thanks very much. Kind of circle back around. Again, I mentioned back in 2016 that mobile space overtook the desktop space. And when we stop and think about how many mobile devices we're carrying with us and the corporate data that resides on those mobile devices, right? So I think we can all attest that we've got corporate contacts, you've got a corporate calendar in there, and you probably have some documents, that you save from an email or whatnot on that device. But really, what are we doing to protect it? We talked about the different outbreaks on the mobile side and malicious applications. But again, it's really that not the next threat vector. So we're going to say it's actually, the threat vector that's getting the most attention right now, right? Because as I mentioned before, when I'm speaking to folks, I would say 95+% of folks don't have any protection on that device. And again, if you kind of put your black hat on for a second, you're going to attack the folks that don't have protection and kind of that easiest point of entry, right, to get to that corporate data. One last call for any more questions. Please feel free to raise that hand or drop those in the chat session for me. We'll just give a pause here for that, see if there's anything that's come through, and then Paul, I'll kick it over to you. Alrighty, no more questions. Paul, what can Integra do for the folks on the line?
Good stuff, Colby. I appreciate it. That was really good information. For any of you who are not aware of IntegraONE, we've been in business going into our 29th year here. We have a dedicated security services team, an IoT practice, custom application development. So we're certainly here to help you with any of your current security needs. If anyone has any follow-up questions that didn't come out on the call, please feel free to reach out to us. Thanks for popping that slide up there, Colby. Just a highlight there of IntegraONE services. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to reach out. Don't forget to fill out our survey at the end of our webinar, and everyone will receive their Starbucks card. And again, any questions, please reach out. Thank you all for attending this morning. We appreciate it very much.
Thanks for joining. Really appreciate everybody's time.